The old man at the gas station looked straight at me and said, "A dog only waits that long for one person." And I swear I felt my chest tighten before I even understood what he meant. It was late October in northern Montana, the kind of cold that crawls into your gloves and makes every breath feel sharp. And I had only stopped in the tiny town of Millhaven because my truck's check engine light flickered on about 20 miles back. I remember stepping out into the freezing wind, hearing the rusted gas station sign squeak overhead, and noticing a German shepherd sitting perfectly still near the edge of the parking lot. No leash, no owner, just sitting there like he belonged to the silence itself. His fur was thick and dusty around the legs, his ears alert despite the cold, and his pale brown eyes never left the highway. At first, I figured he belonged to somebody inside the diner across the road. But then the cashier leaned closer and quietly told me the dog had been showing up there every morning for almost 3 months. Same spot, same highway, same stare. Nobody knew where he came from. Nobody could get him to leave. Animal control tried twice, the cashier said. He always comes back before sunrise. I don't know why that hit me so hard. Maybe because I'd spent most of my life leaving places before I got attached to them. Maybe because after the divorce and 14 years in the army, I understood what it felt like to wait for something that wasn't coming back. I grabbed a black coffee and stood near the window watching the shepherd through the steam rising from the cup. Cars passed. 18-wheelers roared down the highway. Snow drifted along the shoulders of the road. But the dog never moved. Not even once. When I finally walked outside, he glanced at me for half a second before looking back toward the mountains again. "Hey, buddy," I said softly, crouching a few feet away. "You waiting on somebody?" The dog didn't react. Not aggressively. Not nervously. Just tired. Like he'd already seen too many strangers try to figure him out. There was something about him that didn't feel wild. He looked trained. Disciplined. The way he sat reminded me of military. Working dogs I'd seen overseas years ago. Calm posture. Constant awareness. Silent patience. I held out part of a beef jerky strip from my jacket pocket, but he ignored it completely. The old man from the pumps walked over slowly, shoving his hands into his coat. "His owner disappeared up in the mountains," he muttered. "At least that's the rumor." I looked back at him. "Disappeared?" The man nodded toward the snow-covered ridges in the distance. "Winter storm rolled in early this year. Search teams looked for almost 2 weeks. Never found much." The shepherd finally stood up then, tall and powerful despite how thin he looked beneath the fur, and for the first time, he turned fully toward me. I expected him to walk away. Instead, he stepped closer and pressed something cold against my boot. I looked down and realized it was an old leather glove, weathered and cracked with age. Stitched into the wrist were 2 faded letters, Jam. The moment I picked it up, the dog stared directly into my eyes like he had been waiting for someone to understand what it meant. And that was the exact second I realized my broken truck might not have stranded me in Millhaven by accident. Most people think trust happens slowly, but sometimes it happens in a single moment when another living thing decides you are safe enough to follow. I slipped the old glove into my jacket pocket while the German shepherd stayed close beside me, watching every movement like he was measuring my intentions. The wind picked up harder across the highway, carrying the smell of snow and pine from the mountains, and I suddenly realized my truck trouble no longer felt like the biggest thing happening that day. "Does he have a name?" I asked the old man. He shrugged. Nobody ever got close enough to know. The dog looked at me again, then toward the mountains, then back at me. It was deliberate, almost impatient. I had seen that kind of focus before during my army years, especially with trained dogs trying to communicate something their handlers were missing. I crouched slowly and held out my hand again. This time, the shepherd stepped forward just enough for me to touch the side of his neck. His fur was freezing. Cold. Beneath the thick coat, I could feel how thin he had gotten. "You have been out here alone a long time, have you not?" I whispered. His ears twitched at the sound of my voice. The cashier came outside carrying a paper bag. "Turkey sandwich," she said softly. "Maybe he will eat for you." I opened the wrapper carefully and broke off a small piece. The shepherd hesitated only a second before finally taking it from my hand. Not greedy, not desperate, controlled, disciplined, the kind of restraint that comes from years beside humans. That was when I noticed the faded green collar hidden under his fur. Most of the tag was scratched beyond recognition, but one word remained visible beneath the dirt and wear. "Ranger." "Well," I said quietly, scratching behind his ear for the first time. "I guess now I know your name." The dog closed his eyes for half a second, and something about that tiny moment hit me harder than I expected. Maybe because it had been years since another creature looked relieved to see me. My phone buzzed in my pocket with a message from the repair shop 2 towns over. The part for my truck would not arrive until tomorrow afternoon. Under normal circumstances, that news would have irritated me. Instead, I found myself staring at the snowy ridgeline in the distance. "Where exactly did the owner disappear?" I asked. The old man pointed toward a narrow forest road just outside town. "Old Fire Lookout Trail. County shut most of it down after the storm." I should have walked away right then. Any smart person would have. I was 48 years old, tired, divorced, halfway through a cross-country drive to nowhere in particular, and absolutely not looking for mysteries hidden in frozen mountains. But Ranger suddenly stood up and started walking toward the edge of the parking lot. After a few steps, he stopped and looked back at me. Waiting. I felt a strange pressure in my chest again. The kind that tells you life is quietly placing something important in front of you. "You want me to follow you?" I asked. His tail moved once. Just once. I looked toward my truck, then toward the highway stretching endlessly south, then back to the dog standing in the falling snow. The truth was, I had spent the last 3 years drifting through life without a real destination anyway. Maybe that was why I grabbed my coat tighter, checked the flashlight in my glove compartment, and followed the German Shepherd toward the mountains without fully understanding why I trusted him already. There is something unsettling about following a dog into the mountains at dusk, especially when every instinct tells you that turning around would be the smarter choice. Snow crunched beneath my boots as Ranger moved ahead of me along the narrow forest road, never rushing too far forward, but never slowing enough to let me forget he was leading. The fading daylight painted the pine trees dark blue against the sky, and cold air rolled down from the higher ridges hard enough to sting my face. I kept telling myself I was only walking a little way up the trail, just enough to satisfy my curiosity before heading back to town. But deep down I already knew that was not true. Ranger glanced behind him every few minutes as if checking whether I was still there. That simple gesture did something strange to me. It had been a long time since anyone waited for me. About half a mile into the trail, we passed an old wooden sign nearly buried in snow. "Fire Lookout Road. Closed for winter." The metal gate beside it hung crooked from one hinge. Ranger slipped through without hesitation. I followed. The farther we climbed, the quieter the world became. No traffic, no voices, just wind brushing through pine branches and the distant creak of frozen trees shifting in the cold. I noticed paw prints scattered along the snow ahead of us, some fresh, some nearly covered from earlier storms. He had walked this path many times, maybe every day since his owner disappeared. The thought sat heavy in my chest. "You really came all the way up here alone?" I muttered. Ranger slowed slightly beside me, and for the first time I noticed a faint limp in his back leg. Not severe, but enough to tell me the mountain had taken its toll on him too. We reached a clearing about 20 minutes later where the remains of an old ranger station stood against the trees. Most of the windows were boarded up, and snow had drifted nearly halfway up the walls. Ranger stopped near the porch stairs and stared at the front door. I climbed the steps carefully, the wood groaning beneath my weight. The padlock hanging from the door looked old and rusted, untouched for years. "Nobody has been here recently," I whispered. Ranger suddenly moved toward the side of the building, nose low against the snow. I followed him around back and saw him stop near a cluster of rocks beside the tree line. He began pawing gently at the snow. My stomach tightened. I crouched beside him and brushed the snow away with my gloves until metal appeared beneath the ice. A backpack, frozen stiff. I pulled it free carefully and unzipped the top compartment. Inside were a flashlight, protein bars long expired, and a weather-damaged notebook wrapped in plastic. Ranger sat beside me completely still while I opened it. Most of the pages were ruined from moisture, but one entry near the back remained readable. November 14th. Storm moving faster than forecast. Ranger will not leave my side. If somebody finds this, tell Emily I kept my promise. My pulse slowed for a second when I saw the signature at the bottom. Jacob Mercer. The initials from the glove. I stared at the notebook while snowflakes drifted across the page, and I realized this was no longer just some small-town mystery about a loyal dog waiting beside a highway. Somewhere in these mountains was the rest of a story that Ranger had been trying to lead someone back to for months. The strange thing about loneliness is that you stop noticing how heavy it feels until you suddenly share the silence with someone else. I sat on the frozen ground beside Ranger while the wind carried snow through the trees around us, reading Jacob Mercer's words over and over again beneath the weak beam of my flashlight. If somebody finds this, tell Emily I kept my promise. I could not explain why that sentence stayed with me so strongly, but something about it felt unfinished in the worst possible way. Ranger lowered himself beside me, his eyes fixed on the notebook as if he recognized every word inside it. Who was Emily? I asked quietly. The dog tilted his head slightly at the sound of the name. I slipped the notebook back into the backpack and stood carefully, brushing snow from my jeans. Darkness was settling across the mountains fast now, turning the forest into shifting shadows between the pine trees. Every practical instinct told me to head back before the trail disappeared completely under the storm rolling in. But Ranger was already moving again, walking farther uphill past the ranger station. I stared at him for a second in disbelief. "You are kidding me," I muttered before following. The trail narrowed as we climbed higher along the ridge. Ice cracked beneath my boots near the edges where snow covered shallow streams running beneath the rocks. Ranger stayed close now, slowing whenever I lost footing. It felt less like a dog leading a stranger and more like a partner making sure I kept up. After nearly another half-mile, the trees finally opened into a steep overlook facing the valley below. The view would have been beautiful under different circumstances. Tiny lights from Millhaven glowed far beneath us like scattered candles against the snow. Ranger walked toward a fallen pine tree near the cliffside and stopped completely. Something about the stillness in his body made my pulse tighten. I approached slowly beside him and noticed a weathered thermos half buried in snow near the trunk. Then I saw the torn piece of red flannel caught against a branch nearby. Fresh snow had preserved everything almost exactly where it had fallen months earlier. Ranger sat down quietly beside the tree and looked toward the slope below. I understood immediately. Jacob Mercer had been here. I removed my gloves slowly, running one hand across the rough bark while cold wind whipped through the overlook. "You stayed?" I whispered to the dog. Even after everyone else stopped searching. Ranger rested his head briefly against my leg, and for a moment I could not speak at all. The loyalty of animals can make human beings feel small sometimes. I had seen soldiers leave friends behind emotionally long before they ever left physically. But this dog had crossed freezing mountains day after day for months because somewhere deep inside he still believed his person mattered. My throat tightened unexpectedly. I thought about my own life back in Ohio. Empty apartment. Missed phone calls from my daughter I never returned quickly enough. Years spent convincing myself distance was easier than disappointment. Standing there beside Ranger, I suddenly hated how numb I had allowed myself to become. Snow began falling harder now, thick enough to blur the valley lights below us. Ranger stood and nudged my hand firmly with his nose before turning back toward the trail. He was ready to leave. Not panicked, not confused, just calm, like he had finally shown someone what he needed them to see. As we started back down the mountain together through the deepening snow, I realized something had shifted inside me too. I had come to Millhaven as a man trying to outrun his own life. But somewhere between the frozen notebook and the silent mountain ridge, a German shepherd had quietly reminded me what it meant to care about something again. By the time Ranger and I reached Millhaven again, snow was falling so hard the entire town looked softer somehow, like the storm was trying to cover every unfinished story beneath a blanket of white. The diner lights glowed warmly across the street as we stepped back onto the highway, and for the first time since I met him, Ranger walked directly beside me instead of several feet ahead. People noticed immediately. The cashier behind the gas station counter looked up in shock when the dog calmly followed me inside without hesitation. "Well, I will be damned," the old man near the coffee machine whispered. He picked somebody. I removed my gloves beside the heater while Ranger lowered himself onto the floor near my boots, exhausted but peaceful in a way I had not seen before. Snow melted slowly from his fur, leaving small puddles around him. The cashier brought over a bowl of water and another sandwich without even asking. Ranger ate this time. Not fast, but steadily, like some part of him had finally relaxed enough to remember he needed food. I leaned back in the chair and pulled Jacob Mercer's notebook from my jacket again. The old man studied the cover carefully before his expression changed. Mercer, he muttered. Yeah, that was his name. I looked up immediately. You knew him? The man nodded slowly and sat across from me. Not well. Quiet guy. Mid-30s maybe. Came through town every couple of weeks. Always had that dog with him. He glanced toward Ranger. Everybody remembered the dog. I opened the notebook carefully between us. Who was Emily? The old man rubbed his jaw for a second before answering. His daughter. Something about the word daughter hit me harder than I expected. Maybe because I had spent the last few years failing at being the kind of father my own daughter deserved. Jacob used to bring her here in the summers. The cashier added softly from behind the counter. Little blonde kid. Could not have been older than 8 or 9. She smiled faintly. That dog followed her everywhere. Ranger lifted his head slightly at the sound of Emily's name. The old man continued speaking quietly. After his wife passed away, Jacob kind of disappeared into those mountains. Started working fire lookouts seasonally. Folks said he liked the isolation. He paused before adding, but he loved that little girl. Outside, wind rattled the diner windows while snow buried the highway inch by inch. I stared down at the notebook again, trying to piece together why Jacob had written that final sentence. Tell Emily I kept my promise. Promise about what? Ranger stood suddenly and walked toward the front door. I thought he needed to go outside until he stopped beside the lost and found shelf near the entrance. Hanging from one of the hooks was an old, faded photograph someone had probably left there weeks ago. Ranger stared at it intensely. I stepped closer and pulled it down carefully. My chest tightened immediately. The picture showed Jacob Mercer kneeling beside Ranger with a smiling little girl wrapped in a red winter coat between them. Emily. On the back of the photograph, written in faded blue ink, were 4 simple words. Best friends find their way home. I do not know why that sentence nearly broke me right there beside the diner door, but suddenly I could not stop thinking about how many people spend years searching for home without realizing it was never really a place. Sometimes it was a person, sometimes it was forgiveness, and sometimes, apparently, it was a German shepherd who refused to stop waiting for someone he loved. That night, sleep felt impossible. The storm outside rattled the motel windows while Ranger lay curled near the heater at the foot of my bed, finally warm after months of surviving freezing mountain nights alone. Every so often he lifted his head toward the door like he still expected someone else to walk through it. I understood that feeling better than I wanted to admit. Around 2 in the morning, I sat at the tiny table beneath the buzzing motel light and kept reading through the pages of Jacob Mercer's notebook. Most of the entries were simple observations about weather conditions, trail maintenance, and wildlife sightings, but scattered between them were small pieces of a father trying to hold himself together after loss. Emily misses her mother more during winter. Ranger sleeps outside her bedroom every night now. Another entry farther back read, promised Emily I would stop running from life after this season. Bring Ranger home for good. I stared at those words for a long time. It sounded like Jacob had been trying to rebuild something before the storm took him. Ranger suddenly stood and walked over beside me, resting his head against my arm while I turned another page. Folded carefully inside the notebook was an old drawing made with crayons. 3 stick figures holding hands beside a large dog beneath a yellow sun. Across the top, written in uneven child handwriting, were the words Dad, me, and Ranger forever. My throat tightened so suddenly I had to look away. I thought about my own daughter, Claire, back in Columbus. She was 20 now. Smart. Funny. Patient for far longer than I deserved. After the divorce, I convinced myself giving her space was somehow the same thing as respecting her independence, but deep down I knew the truth. It was easier hiding inside work, road trips, and isolation than admitting I had no idea how to reconnect after years of emotional distance. Ranger watched me quietly while snow continued falling outside the motel window. You know, I whispered to him. I used to think being alone made things simpler. His ears lifted slightly at the sound of my voice. Turns out it just makes everything quieter. The next morning the storm finally eased, leaving Millhaven buried beneath nearly 10 inches of fresh snow. Ranger stayed close while I carried the notebook and photograph into the sheriff's office across town. Sheriff Dana Holloway was a woman in her late 50s with silver hair tucked beneath a heavy winter jacket and the tired eyes of someone who had spent years watching small towns carry invisible grief. The moment she saw Ranger step inside behind me, Her expression changed completely. "Good Lord," she whispered. Ranger walked directly toward her desk and sat calmly. Sheriff Holloway crouched slowly, visibly emotional as she touched the side of his neck. "You stubborn old boy," she murmured. "You actually found somebody." I handed her Jacob's notebook carefully. She read the final page in silence while the office grew completely still around us. Finally, she looked up at me with wet eyes. "Emily Mercer lives in Spokane now with her aunt," she said softly. After Jacob disappeared, they stopped searching once winter closed the mountain passes. She glanced down at Ranger again. But this dog never stopped. I felt something shift inside my chest when she said those words. Because suddenly it was no longer just about a missing man or a loyal dog. It was about a promise that still mattered to somebody waiting hundreds of miles away, probably believing she would never have answers. Some phone calls change your day, but others quietly change the direction of your entire life. Sheriff Holloway sat behind her desk holding the notebook while Ranger rested near my chair, calmer than I had ever seen him. Snowlight filtered through the office windows, covering the room in that pale winter glow small towns seem to wear during storms. "Emily is 17 now," the sheriff explained while searching through old files on her computer. "She moved to Spokane with her aunt after her father disappeared. From what I heard, she stopped talking about Montana altogether after the first year." Ranger lifted his head at the sound of Emily's name again. The sheriff noticed it too and smiled sadly. He remembers every word. A few minutes later, she found a phone number and leaned back slowly. "You want me to make the call?" she asked. I looked down at Ranger beside me. The German shepherd stared back with quiet patience, as if this moment was the entire reason he had survived the winter. "No," I said softly. "I think I should." My hand felt strangely heavy holding the phone. I had spoken in front of military crowds before. I had sat through divorce hearings without blinking. But somehow calling a teenage girl to tell her I found her father's dog felt harder than all of that combined. The line rang 3 times before a woman answered cautiously. "Hello." "Hi." I began carefully. "My name is Ethan Cole. I am calling from Millhaven, Montana. Is Emily there?" Silence followed immediately. Then the woman's tone changed. "Why?" I glanced at Ranger before answering. "Because I think I found someone who belongs to her." A few seconds later, I heard movement, muffled voices. Then a younger voice came onto the line. "This is Emily." She sounded older than the little girl from the photograph, but still young enough for the sadness underneath her voice to feel unfair. I swallowed hard. "Emily, I know this is going to sound strange, but I met a German shepherd named Ranger 2 days ago." The silence that followed was so complete, I thought the call had dropped. Then I heard her breathing change sharply. "What did you say?" she whispered. Ranger stood immediately the moment her voice came through the phone speaker. His ears rose high, and his tail moved slowly behind him for the first time since I met him. "He is here with me now," I said quietly. "He has been waiting in Millhaven for months." Emily started crying before I could finish the sentence. Not loud, not dramatic, just the sound of somebody trying to hold together emotions they buried a long time ago. Ranger pressed closer against my leg, staring directly at the phone like he understood every word. "They told me he disappeared too," she finally managed to say. "They said the storm probably." Her voice broke. Apart again. I looked at the notebook on the desk beside me. "Emily," I said gently, "your father left something behind." I read her the final line from Jacob's notebook exactly as he wrote it. "Tell Emily I kept my promise." On the other end of the line, she cried harder after hearing those words. Then she whispered something that made my chest tighten instantly. "He promised he would always come home to me." Nobody spoke for several seconds after that. Even Sheriff Holloway quietly looked away. Finally, Emily asked the question I think she had been carrying for months. Was he alone? I looked down at Ranger sitting beside my chair, loyal even now after everything. "No," I answered softly. He was not alone. After the call ended, the sheriff's office felt strangely quiet. Like every person in the room understood something important had just happened, but nobody quite knew how to put it into words. Ranger stayed beside me, while Sheriff Holloway carefully placed Jacob's notebook into an evidence envelope for safekeeping. Outside, the snowstorm had finally passed, and sunlight reflected across the streets of Millhaven so brightly it almost hurt to look at. "Emily wants to come here," the sheriff said after a while. "Her aunt says they can drive in tomorrow if the roads stay clear." Ranger reacted instantly when she said tomorrow. His ears lifted and his entire posture sharpened with attention. I looked down at him and could not help smiling slightly. I think he understood that. Sheriff Holloway leaned against her desk with folded arms. Dogs like him usually do. I spent the rest of the afternoon helping clear snow outside the diner because the owner refused to let me pay for another meal after hearing Ranger's story. Small towns are like that sometimes. People carry each other quietly without making a performance out of kindness. Ranger followed me everywhere while we worked, occasionally stopping to watch the highway, as if years of waiting had become habit too deeply rooted to break overnight. At one point, the cashier stepped outside holding 2 cups of coffee and handed one to me. "You know," she said carefully, "he never went home with anyone before." I rubbed the side of Ranger's neck while steam rose from the coffee cup into the freezing air. "I do not think he was looking for a home," I replied. "I think he was looking for someone willing to listen." That night, the diner owner invited me to dinner with a few locals who had known Jacob Mercer over the years. They told stories about him quietly, the way people speak about someone they respected but never fully understood. Jacob apparently spent most evenings alone after his wife died. He worked hard, kept promises, never complained much. The only time people consistently saw him smile was when Emily or Ranger were nearby. Listening to them talk, I realized something painful about adulthood. Sometimes people disappear long before anybody notices they are struggling. Ranger rested beneath the table during dinner, occasionally lifting his head whenever someone said Jacob's name. The old man from the gas station shook his head slowly while looking at the dog. "I still cannot believe he survived up there all winter," he muttered. "Most animals would have wandered off." "Not him," I answered quietly. "He had a reason to stay." Later that evening, I walked Ranger through the center of town beneath clear skies filled with stars. Fresh snow covered everything in silence. Storefront lights reflected across the icy sidewalks while cold mountain air burned in my lungs. Ranger walked close beside me now without hesitation, his limp already seeming slightly better after food and warmth. We passed the gas station where I first saw him sitting alone beside the highway, and he paused there briefly before looking up at me instead of the mountains. That tiny moment hit harder than I expected. For the first time since I met him, he was no longer waiting for someone who never came back. Somehow, against all logic, we had carried him to the next part of the story. Back at the motel, my phone buzzed unexpectedly while Ranger curled beside the bed. The screen showed a name I had not seen in nearly 3 weeks. "Claire, my daughter." I stared at the phone longer than I should have before finally answering. "Hey, Dad," she said softly. "You okay? I have been trying to reach you." I looked down at Ranger sleeping peacefully against the heater and realized something uncomfortable all at once. Somewhere along the way, a stranded German shepherd had done more than lead me through the mountains. He had quietly started leading me back toward my own life too. There are moments when guilt arrives so quietly you almost mistake it for memory. I sat on the edge of the motel bed with my phone pressed against my ear while Claire waited for an answer on the other end of the line. Ranger slept nearby, one paw twitching slightly in his dreams, probably finally resting properly for the first time in months. "Yeah," I said after a second too long. "I am okay." Claire exhaled softly, and I could hear city traffic somewhere behind her in Columbus. "You disappeared again," she said gently. There was no anger in her voice anymore, which somehow felt worse. Just exhaustion. I rubbed my hand across my face and stared out the motel window toward the snow-covered highway. "I know," I admitted quietly. "I am sorry." Another silence followed. For years, our conversations had sounded exactly like this. Careful, polite, like 2 people standing on opposite sides of a cracked bridge neither one knew how to cross anymore. Then Claire surprised me. "Mom said you were driving west," she said. "Where are you now?" I looked down at Ranger curled against the heater. "Tiny town in Montana called Millhaven." "What are you doing there?" she asked. I almost gave my usual answer. "Nothing much. Just passing through." But for some reason I did not. Instead, I told her about Ranger. About the gas station. The mountains. Jacob Mercer's notebook. Emily. The waiting. All of it. Claire stayed completely quiet while I spoke, and somewhere during the story I realized it was the longest honest conversation we had shared in years. When I finally stopped talking, she whispered something so softly I nearly missed it. "That dog sounds more loyal than most people." I looked over at Ranger again. "Yeah," I replied. "He really is." Claire laughed faintly for the first time during the call. You sound different, she said. Different how? I do not know, she answered after thinking for a moment. Less lost. Maybe. Her words stayed with me long after the call ended. The next morning, Millhaven woke beneath bright blue skies and fresh snow sparkling across rooftops and pine trees. Ranger stood at the motel window before sunrise watching the road like he already sensed something important was coming. Around 10 o'clock, Sheriff Holloway called to say Emily and her aunt had crossed into town. The moment I hung up, Ranger became alert in a way I had not seen before. His ears lifted high. His tail moved slowly. Every muscle in his body focused toward the highway outside. Easy, buddy, I murmured, grabbing my coat. They are coming. The sheriff asked us to meet at the diner because it was warmer and quieter than the station. By the time we arrived, half the town already seemed to know what was happening. People pretended not to stare while Ranger paced near the front window, eyes fixed on every passing vehicle. I could practically feel the tension rolling off him. Then, just after 11, a dark blue SUV turned slowly into the parking lot. Ranger froze instantly, completely still. The passenger door opened first, and a teenage girl stepped out wearing a gray winter coat and knitted gloves. Blonde hair, pale eyes, same smile from the old photograph, only older now and carrying far more sadness. Emily Mercer looked toward the diner window uncertainly at first. Then Ranger let out the quietest sound I had heard from him since the day we met. Not a bark, not a whine, just one broken breath full of recognition. Emily covered her mouth immediately as tears rushed into her eyes. Ranger, she whispered through the glass. And the dog who had waded through storms, loneliness, and endless mountain nights suddenly ran toward the door like his heart had finally found its way home. Some reunions are loud and dramatic, but the ones that truly matter usually happen in silence because emotions become too big for words. The second Emily stepped through the diner door, Ranger reached her before anyone else could move. The German shepherd pressed against her so hard, she nearly lost balance, his tail striking chairs and table legs while soft sounds escaped his throat that felt almost human. Emily dropped to her knees immediately, wrapping both arms around his neck as tears streamed down her face. Oh my God, she kept whispering over and over again. Oh my God, Ranger. The entire diner fell completely silent around them. Even the cook stopped moving behind the counter. Ranger buried his face against Emily's shoulder, trembling with relief while she held on to him like she was afraid he might disappear again if she let go. Watching them together felt strangely sacred somehow, like witnessing something private and deeply human that words could never fully explain. Emily looked older than the girl in the photograph, but grief had a way of aging people faster than time should allow. Still, the moment Ranger recognized her, something lighter returned to her face too. Something she had probably not felt since losing her father. You waited for me, she whispered to the dog while holding his face between her hands. You actually waited. Ranger licked tears from her cheeks gently before resting his head against her chest again. I noticed Sheriff Holloway quietly wiping her eyes near the register while several locals stared down into their coffee cups pretending not to cry themselves. Emily's aunt, Karen, walked over to me after a moment and shook my hand tightly. You are Ethan? She asked softly. I nodded. Thank you, she said immediately, emotion catching in her voice. After the storm, after they stopped searching, Emily stopped believing she would ever have any piece of her father back. I glanced toward Ranger and Emily sitting together on the diner floor. I think Ranger disagreed with everybody else. Karen laughed weakly through tears. That sounds exactly like Jacob too. A little later, Emily finally stood and walked over to me while keeping one hand buried in Ranger's fur the entire time, almost like she still needed physical proof he was real. You were the man who found him? She asked quietly. Actually, I answered with a small smile, he found me. For the first time since arriving, Emily smiled too. It was tired and emotional, but real. We sat together in a booth while Ranger lay protectively beside her feet. I gave her the photograph, the glove, and finally Jacob's notebook. Emily held it carefully in both hands like something fragile enough to break from memory alone. When she reached the final page, her breathing caught. She touched her father's handwriting gently before closing her eyes. He always wrote things down when he was scared, she whispered, said it helped him think clearly. She looked at me again. Thank you for bringing this back. I shook my head slowly. Your father did that, I replied. Ranger just made sure somebody listened. Snow melted slowly outside beneath bright afternoon sunlight, while the diner gradually returned to normal conversation around us. But something inside me remained unsettled in a different way now. Watching Emily and Ranger together hurt unexpectedly because it reminded me how much time can disappear while people wait for us to come home emotionally. I thought about Claire again. The missed birthdays, the short phone calls, the years spent convincing myself distance protected both of us from disappointment. Ranger lifted his head briefly and looked directly at me from beside Emily's chair, and for a strange second, it almost felt like the dog understood exactly what I was thinking. Maybe loyalty is not just about staying beside someone during the good moments. Maybe it is about refusing to give up on people even after they start giving up on themselves. The hardest part about healing is that it usually begins long before you realize you are finally ready for it. Emily and Karen stayed in Millhaven longer than planned because another snowstorm rolled across the mountain pass that evening, closing the highway west until morning. The diner owner offered them rooms above the restaurant, and somehow all of us ended up eating dinner together like people who had known one another far longer than a few days. Ranger stayed close beside Emily the entire time, never letting her drift more than a few feet away. Every so often she reached down absent-mindedly to touch his fur, almost reassuring herself he was still there. I understood that feeling. Certain losses change people so deeply that even hope starts feeling dangerous. After dinner, Emily and I sat outside beneath the diner awning while snow drifted quietly across the empty street. Ranger rested between us with his head on Emily's boots. The town looked peaceful beneath the streetlights, but there was sadness underneath the beauty too. The kind small towns carry after losing people before their stories feel finished. Emily held her father's notebook tightly in her lap while staring at the falling snow. You know what hurts the most? She asked after a long silence. I shook my head gently. I was angry at him before he disappeared. Her voice cracked slightly. The night before the storm, we argued on the phone because he missed my school concert. She swallowed hard. I told him he cared more about those mountains than he cared about me. Ranger slowly lifted his head at the tension in her voice. Emily stroked his fur automatically while tears filled her eyes again. Then he never came home, she whispered. And those were the last words I ever said to him. I stared out at the snow-covered highway for a moment before answering. I think every parent disappoints their kid eventually. She looked over at me. Yeah. I nodded slowly. My daughter barely calls me anymore. Saying it out loud hurt more than I expected. I spent years thinking I had more time to fix things. Emily was quiet for a while after that. Then she surprised me by asking, "Why did you stop trying?" The question hit harder than she probably intended. I rubbed my hands together against the cold while searching for an honest answer. Because failing once makes people afraid to fail again, I admitted. After enough mistakes, some people stop reaching out because distance feels safer than rejection. Emily looked down at Ranger sleeping peacefully beside her. My dad used to say Ranger never cared how many bad days somebody had, she said softly. He always showed up anyway. I laughed quietly under my breath. Yeah, I noticed that. We sat there together listening to wind move through the frozen streets while snowflakes gathered along Ranger's thick fur. For the first time in years, I realized I did not feel restless. Normally, I was always thinking about the next highway, the next motel, the next distraction from my own life. But sitting there beside a grieving teenager and an exhausted German shepherd somehow felt more honest than anything I had experienced in a long time. Before heading inside for the night, Emily reached into her pocket and handed me a folded piece of paper. Dad wrote this last summer, she explained quietly. I think you should read it. Later, alone in my motel room, while Ranger snored softly near the heater, I unfolded the paper carefully. It was a handwritten note from Jacob Mercer. Most people think strength means carrying everything alone. Truth is, strength usually means having the courage to come back before it is too late. I read that sentence 3 times in complete silence. Then, before I could change my mind, I picked up my phone and booked a flight home to Columbus for the following week. The next morning arrived with clear skies, fresh snow glittering across the mountains, and the strange feeling that something important was ending while something else quietly began. Millhaven looked almost beautiful enough to forget the sadness it had carried for months. Smoke drifted from chimneys, Trucks rolled carefully down plowed streets, and sunlight stretched across the frozen highway where Ranger had spent so many mornings waiting alone. But this time he was not sitting beside the road watching the mountains anymore. He was standing beside Emily outside the diner, calm and steady, his tail moving slowly whenever she spoke to him. The transformation in him over the last 24 hours was impossible to ignore. He looked lighter somehow, like loyalty had finally been allowed to rest. Emily zipped up her winter coat, while Karen loaded bags into their SUV nearby. "I still cannot believe this is real," she admitted quietly, scratching Ranger behind the ears. "Part of me thought I would never see him again." Ranger leaned gently against her side without taking his eyes off her face. I smiled faintly. "I think he spent months making sure that never happened." Emily laughed softly, but sadness still lingered behind it. "Do you think my dad knew?" she asked after a moment. "Knew what?" "That Ranger would keep trying to come back to us." I looked out toward the mountains rising above town. "Honestly," I said quietly, "I think your father trusted him more than he trusted the storm." Emily stared down at Ranger while emotion filled her expression again. Before leaving town, Sheriff Holloway arranged for a small memorial at the overlook where Ranger had led me days earlier. Nothing formal, just a few people standing together beneath pine trees and cold mountain wind while snow drifted across the ridge. The sheriff read a few lines from Jacob's notebook, while Emily held Ranger close beside her. Nobody spoke much after that. The silence felt more respectful somehow. At one point, Emily walked toward the fallen pine tree alone and stood there staring across the valley for a long time. When she finally returned, her eyes were red but peaceful. "I think he loved it up here," she whispered. "The quiet." I nodded slowly. "Yeah, I think he did too." As we started back toward town, Emily suddenly stopped beside me. "My dad would have liked you," she said unexpectedly. The words caught me off guard. "I doubt that," I answered with a small laugh. "No," she insisted gently. "He always trusted people who were still trying to figure themselves out." Ranger looked between us before nudging my hand with his nose. I scratched behind his ears automatically while fighting the tight feeling rising in my chest again. Back at the diner parking lot, Karen finished packing the SUV while Emily stood beside the passenger door, holding Ranger's leash loosely in one hand. Neither of them looked ready to leave. Truthfully, neither was I. It is strange how quickly people can become important to each other when honesty enters the room before pretending does. Emily stepped closer suddenly and hugged me tightly before I could react. "Thank you," she whispered against my jacket. "Not just for finding him, for staying." I closed my eyes briefly and hugged her back. "Take care of each other," I said quietly. Ranger pressed against my leg one final time before climbing into the SUV beside Emily. Even then, he kept watching me through the window while the engine started. Karen rolled down her window and smiled warmly. "You ever pass through Spokane?" she said. "You have a place to stay." I nodded, unable to answer properly for a second. Then the SUV slowly pulled away from the diner and disappeared down the snow-covered highway with Ranger and Emily finally together again. I stood there long after they vanished from sight, cold wind moving through the empty parking lot, realizing the town suddenly felt much quieter than before. But for the first time in years, the silence inside me did not feel empty anymore. People talk about life-changing moments like lightning strikes, but most of the time change happens quietly in small decisions nobody else notices. 3 weeks after leaving Millhaven, I stood outside a coffee shop in downtown Columbus holding 2 cups in freezing February air while snow drifted softly across parked cars. My apartment was only 6 blocks away, but for once I was not rushing back to an empty room just to sit alone with the television on for noise. Through the cafe window, I could see Claire waving at me from a table near the corner. I smiled before stepping inside. It still felt strange how quickly things had started shifting after Montana. Not perfectly. Life never works that way. Claire and I still had awkward conversations sometimes. There were still long pauses where years of distance sat heavily between us. But now we stayed through the uncomfortable parts instead of avoiding them. That was new. "You are late," Claire teased while taking the coffee from my hand. "Traffic," I replied automatically before both of us laughed because neither of us believed that excuse for a second. We sat together watching snow fall beyond the windows while people hurried through the cold outside. Claire looked healthier than the last time I really paid attention. Happier too. At one point she reached into her purse and handed me a small framed photograph. My chest tightened immediately when I saw it. Emily and Ranger standing together beneath pine trees in Montana. Ranger looked stronger now, his coat healthy again, his eyes calmer. Emily had included a handwritten note on the back. Ranger still sleeps beside the front door every night, but now I think he finally understands somebody came home. Thank you for helping both of us find our way back. I stared at the words quietly while emotion pressed hard against my chest again. Claire noticed immediately. That dog really changed you, huh? She asked softly. I leaned back in the chair and looked out at the snowfall for a long moment before answering. No, I said quietly. I think he reminded me who I was before I started hiding from everybody. Claire smiled faintly across the table. Well, she said, I like this version better. A few days later, I finally unpacked the last box sitting untouched in my apartment since the divorce. Inside were old photographs, military patches, birthday cards from Claire, and years of memories I had avoided because looking backward hurt too much. Near the bottom of the box, I found a picture of Claire at 8 years old sitting beside a golden retriever we used to own. She was hugging the dog exactly the same way Emily hugged Ranger in the diner. Kids love with their whole hearts before the world teaches them to be careful. Maybe that is why dogs understand them so well. That evening my phone buzzed with a new message from an unknown number. It was a video from Emily. Ranger stood outside in falling snow somewhere in Spokane while Emily laughed behind the camera. The second she said my name, Ranger's ears lifted instantly and his tail started wagging hard enough to shake his entire body. I could not stop smiling while watching it. Then another message appeared beneath the video. Dad used to say some people come into your life for a reason even if they were only supposed to be passing through. I sat there alone in my apartment for a while after reading that, listening to wind rattle softly against the windows and thinking about a broken truck, a frozen mountain town, and a German shepherd who refused to abandon someone he loved. Funny enough, I went to Montana believing I was completely lost. Turns out sometimes the people who feel most alone are only one act of loyalty away from finding their way home again.